you.
No problem. Welcome. Okay, let's go ahead and just start. And I know folks are joining us. And I'll just say once again, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Division 17's second internship webinar. I'm Marie Miville. I'm the Vice President for Division 17's Education and Training, and it's my pleasure to serve as this evening's moderator. So as a lot of you are aware, I mean, there's over 100 of you listening to this tonight, and by the way, we are recording this session. The internship process is, of course, a very important part of your training, and it's also an intensely challenging process, and one that can sometimes feel very competitive and, you know, something that sometimes we just focus on more the negative aspects. So today we just really want to focus on how you can best prepare yourself for this process. So given the time of year, we're heading into summer and fall. That's the natural time where students begin to think about, gee, are they going to be applying for internship, and to beginning to identify where they want to go, what kind of interests they have, and to look at also their experiences. And so if you look at our agenda that we have up for you on this slide, you'll see we have some really discrete topics. So what we're going to do is go through each of these topics, and after each topic I'm going to check in for questions from our question moderator. And as you see on our slide, you are muted upon entrance to the webinar, so this is a listen only if you're a participant. However, you do have the potential to ask questions, and so there's this little question section that we ask you to type in a question if you got one. So we're going to try and integrate questions as they fit with the topic areas. So if something strikes you as we're talking about simply like readiness to apply, feel free to type in a question, and we're going to do our best to get to as many as we can. I can guarantee you that we're not going to get to all of them, not with over 100 of you, but we're going to do our best to hit some of the key questions that we know students have. Okay, so the other thing we also like to do with this webinar is to think about how internship applies specifically to counseling psych students. So all of the panelists have a counseling psychology background, and they welcome counseling psych applicants into their site. So we've been really careful to include sites that traditionally our students are very interested in applying. Okay, so if you find this event is helpful to you, also know that there's another webinar that we did in the fall that was, it's oddly enough, we're doing this sort of backwards. So the one in the fall is about interviewing and all the things that happen after you submit your application. Because by the time we got to organizing this, it was already past deadline for internship apps. So we decided, you know, if that's successful, and it was, we got really good feedback from students, let's do the one in the spring for applications. So here we are. Okay, so before we begin, though, I really would like to thank my colleagues, introduce my colleagues, as well as thank a few others. And especially I want to thank our fabulous SAS leaders, two of whom are here tonight. Brittan Davis, who's going to serve as our successful intern applicant. She just went through it. We're very thrilled. She got placed at UPenn, University of Pennsylvania, the counseling service there. I also want to introduce Dr. Eve Adams, who's an academic training director. Michael Martin, if you just hold your hand up, I think our names are on there. Okay. Michael Martin, who's with the VA, the Atlanta VA Medical Center, psychology executive, and Dr. Ann Covey at Texas A&M, and she's also the training director there. And then Dr. Chris Sheldon, who is the chief psychologist at Denver Health. I also want to acknowledge Erica Wiley-Whiteman. You don't see her on the screen, but she's going to be very key to you all because she's our moderator of questions. So we wanted to have somebody with full attention to the questions you all have so we can be sure to integrate those well into our session. And also off screen, but no less important, is our fabulous executive director, Debbie Nolan, and Rashida Walks, who have both been very important in setting up just this this platform. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm just going to ask, we don't have anything structured, but what I'll do is just ask questions to open up the topic, and then let each of the panelists speak. And so I'm going to start, of course, with the academic training director and Eve and Britt, to start first, and then ask the internship directors to weigh in as they feel they can contribute. So the first thing we'd like to talk about is this notion of readiness to apply. That is, you can't just simply, as you know, with externship and any kind of fieldwork placement, you can't just decide out of the blue on your own to apply. There's actually a process that most programs have set up with the satisfaction of program requirements that have to be completed, as well as an actual form that your training director does complete that just basically signs off on the faculty as a whole. So it's not just the training director, it's the entire program faculty that signs off on approval to each and every single student who applies for internship. So let me turn now to Eve, just to talk a little bit as an academic training director, what is generally meant by readiness to apply, what are some common program requirements, and so on.
Right. Thanks. Yes. So the first thing I'd want to say is this is relatively program specific, so it would be really important for you to make sure you're looking in your student handbook and talking to the training director as well as advisors, just to make sure you understand the process as it exists at your institution and your program regarding what constitutes readiness to apply. Some places it's more formal than others, and again, the requirements can vary. So for instance, some programs require that you have to have your dissertation proposed by the time you apply, so let's say by November 1st, for instance. Others will say you have to have that dissertation proposal approved by the time you rank. So just know what your own program requirements are. The thing I would just say is that this process involves a great deal of time, it involves money, and a lot of energy. Most of the students that I know will say that this took more time than their application to graduate school. So it's not, as Marie's saying, something you want to enter into lightly, and you need to know you have enough time, first of all, to get everything together and go through that process with the, being able to focus on all that needs to be done and really immerse yourself in that. So I think there's what the program's going to require you to have, but there's also kind of your own internal resources and whether you're ready to do that. So definitely progress on the dissertation is one thing that where are you at in that process? Can you really get it, the proposal done at the time that's required for your process? And knowing that, for instance, if it comes later than when you're applying, that then you're going to be trying to get that document ready for your committee at the same time that you're writing essays and applying. So, you really have to know what your ability to stay organized and on top of all those things. The other thing I just want to say about the internship sites, and they can certainly speak to the different training directors here, but some of them, you will have some sites that aren't interested in you unless you get it done by the time you're applying, and even others that might not say you don't have to have it done by, let's say, the time you apply. They're still probably going to favor folks who do have it done over those of you that don't. So just really taking a look. In the summer is a great time to familiarize yourself with the different sites and what their expectations are. The other thing that I'd say, though, in addition to gaining faculty approval and knowing where you're at in your dissertation proposal process, is being able to really think about if you have the experience that you need up to this point. So I guess what I'm saying is, and we're going to get into more about identifying, but as you start to think about which sites you're at, I would say the minimum number of direct hours, meaning both intervention and assessment hours, you're wanting is 500, and lots of sites want a lot more than that. So this is the time to be thinking about, first of all, where are you at in the number of hours you've obtained, but also in the time you have between now and when you would go off on internship, what are the additional training experiences you want to get? So hopefully you've been doing that all along, but this is definitely a crucial time to be really figuring out, is there some other part to to some training experience you haven't yet gotten, whether it's assessment, for instance, something in it, something that maybe your program doesn't automatically give you as part of the curriculum, but something you're going to have to seek out above and beyond. Sometimes it's just more hours, but sometimes it's specific type of training experiences. So really starting to kind of work on those training goals for the remaining time that you're in the program. And then the one other thing I'll just say by way of kind of introduction is this is not a process to go alone. You really need, sometimes I feel like the students who are do the least or aren't quite as good at getting some of the internship sites that they're wanting is because they're so self-sufficient that they've learned that they can do this on their own, and there's just so much you need in terms of whether it's people reviewing some of the stuff you're going to be submitting, getting advice on whether or not you're ready to apply. There's so many places in which I think additional advice, either from your training director or from faculty or from internship training directors, but you really should be doing this with lots of feedback. That's the point I guess I want to make.
Thank you, Lee. That's very helpful, and we will get much more to the issue of experiences and interests in the site. That's an actual entire topic area, because we know that's usually a really big question that people have. And the other thing I'd like to suggest, also I'm a former academic training director, is in addition to making sure you have sufficient hours, however we're going to define that, making sure that all your coursework is complete, that any I's you have are outstanding are completed, because not only your program faculty have to know that you're ready, but the internship faculty, the internship colleagues must know that when you say yes in that February, you mean yes in September or August or July, whenever it starts. So that is a huge commitment, and so that's one of the things also in terms of cleaning house as you look at your own academic record, is to ensure that all your coursework is ready to go. And as Eve says, every single program has its own defining criteria of what readiness and approval by the program faculty means. So let's turn then to Britt, too, who just went through that, and just even what the process of thinking about readiness felt like to you, and that part of it.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Adams definitely covered a lot of what I had originally planned on saying. You want to definitely familiarize yourself with your own program's handbook, because that will determine what you need to have completed before you actually end up applying or even think about applying. You also want to be in close contact with your director of clinical training, as well as your faculty advisor. You want to make sure that all of those courses are completed, that your comprehensive exams are completed, whatever your program determines as far as the necessary requirements for your proposal. You want to make sure that those things are met. And I would say that it's never too early to start looking at the APIC directory and really familiarizing yourself with the types of sites to which you want to apply, as well as finding some of those specific information, such as how many hours are required, what types of placements do these sites prefer that you have in your practicum training in order to make you a strong candidate. You want to really be looking for fit. So what seems like a good fit for you, whatever that may mean, and really trying to come up with a list so that when you're writing your essays and your cover letters, you're already, I would say even before you start some of your practica, to really be thinking about where you want to apply for internship. So even if you're in your first year or second year, to already start planning and doing training that will make you a strong candidate for wherever you wish to apply. So it's never too late to start any of this.
Okay. Thank you, Brittan. Very helpful. And then I just wanted to check in with our intern colleagues. I know this is really more an academic discussion. And maybe if somebody could mute their line, because I'm hearing a little feedback. Anyway, so I know you don't have much to say necessarily about the actual academic requirements, but just comments for a minute about how important it is for you to feel confident that the applicants you're reviewing have indeed are ready per their program approval process.
Yeah, so I can certainly comment on that. for the amount of applications you get from counseling centers, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to see if in the API that's completed. And if it's not completed, we don't even review it. So I would imagine that's standard at most places. The first part of the API is the readiness to apply, and you see where the faculty endorses the student. And I know I was thinking, since we've even started the API online, I probably only received 2 that this was not completed, but they were done.
That's great.
I also would say there's 2, to know your programs. We've had a couple situations where people have failed a part of their comps and not communicated it to us, and they were still seen as ready to apply, but then in both circumstances they were able to retake it the summer before they came to us, the section, and it worked out fine. But to be sure you communicate that with the training director, because there was a lot of pressure on both those students that if that didn't go well, they would not have been able to go on internship.
Yeah, that's a really important comment. I can say that a lot of programs over the years have just fine-tuned those criteria precisely for that reason. They don't want students and internship sites left hanging with a really important requirement that still has not yet been satisfied by after that they've accepted. So that is really, really critical, because each site's going to have hundreds of applications. So just make sure you're ready to go. Okay, let me check in with Erica to see if there are any questions regarding readiness at this point.
Sure, yeah, we have a few here. Specifically, Taylor would like to know, in order of priority, what are the aspects needed in order to be a good applicant? And she's specifically interested in university counseling centers.
Okay, well, that actually might maybe then go into our training interests and goals. In terms of readiness, is there a question for that right now, or?
Not quite yet. There's
Okay.
some questions about letters of recommendation, and then Marcus had a question about direct contact hours, but not really related to readiness.
Okay, all right. So we'll come back to Taylor's question, very important. Let's just then move on to the next topic, which is identifying training interests and goals. And let me turn it over once again to Eve, just even for some.
I just wonder if Britt wanted to go first on this time around, and I'd follow her.
Okay,
You like
sure.
that? Yeah.
Sure,
Okay.
that's perfect.
Okay.
Okay.
I did see one question come through about whether or not outreach counts as direct hours. So that is, I think, something that maybe is in prepping for your application. So I don't know if we want to address that question now or later.
What are direct hours?
If outreach counts as direct hours.
Yeah, I would just say the answer is yes to that, and we can go into more detail on the API criteria later.
Yeah.
But it's under intervention.
Right.
Outreach is under
Yeah,
intervention.
so those are really important, specific, concrete questions. Right now, let's think about how you identify training interests, goals, and beginning to think about how do you match that up with current sites. And so, Brittan or Eve?
Yeah. For me, it was very easy. I didn't have much difficulty finding sites that I felt were a good match. I needed sites that had a primary focus on social justice, really attended to multicultural issues. I wanted to only apply at college university counseling centers. I was not geographically limited. I was open to applying anywhere, as I just made fit the primary concern as far as where I applied. And as far as identifying my own training interests, I would say that those evolved over time. I had been at 4 different college university counseling centers prior to applying for internship. So at each different college university counseling center, I got to see what I was doing well as those areas of growth. So really trying to keep record of those areas of growth as I continued, as well as I maintained really solid relationships with all of my supervisors so that I was able to talk to them and to process the areas of growth that they saw in me at the end of each of those experiences, as well as prior to applying for internship. So those relationships with my supervisors were incredibly important in applying for internship. I got a lot of feedback from previous supervisors on my materials, as well as helping me to prepare for interviews, and as well as identifying goals, because you will want to talk about your goals in your cover letters. So knowing what it is that you want to work on at each particular site, and then knowing how the site can help you meet those goals. So if you want to work on group therapy, know specific groups that the sites offer so that you can say, these are the particular groups I would really be interested in leading. And you want it to be truthful. You want to read through all the materials, and you want to know what about that site is really attracting you to that site. And to be honest and to have everything that they offer meet those needs, those goals that you have.
Okay, thank you. Excellent. And Eve, any
Sure.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, so some kind of more generally what I look in at is this is life planning. It's a great, you have 1 year here where you can decide, for instance, what are your priorities? APA accreditation may be required. APA accredited internship may be required by your program, but it might not. And if it's not, how many of those sites might you look at that are in the APIC match but aren't APA accredited? And how might that then affect your long-term career goals, depending on how might that eliminate certain possibilities down the road. And then also I think that to me there's this larger question I'm often talking with my students about that's, we shoot for what is our ideal training experience. So as it talks about, you're looking at the type of site you want and the both in terms of setting as well as activities that you get to engage in. But then there's where is that place located, and what other life circumstances do you need to take into account? So is there some geographic restriction for you or not? Or is there a partner whose possibilities for work at that year you need to take into consideration? So I think there's just really kind of some prioritizing that you need to do with anyone else who's involved in that process with you. And again, that takes time because you kind of have clarity, and then you start getting in and you get more information about these different sites, and then your priorities shift a little bit. So you really want to allow yourself time to do that kind of career exploration.
I was going to say that's an awesome point, because there will be times where it feels clear, then it gets murky because you discover some new site, or you go to a site you weren't too thrilled with, then it gets clear, and then it gets murky. And so that is one of the things emotionally that can be challenging about this process.
Right. Or your partner's very flexible when it's hypothetical, and then when it starts to be interviews and it gets more real, it's like, I really don't want to live in. Yeah. And then there's also more practical matters, like some places the cost of living is just really kind of prohibitive for some people depending on their financial resources. So all of a sudden all those things start to become clear. So that to me is just kind of looking at both your personal and your professional priorities and realize they can't really one exists in relation to the other. And ultimately, particularly if you're going for APA accredited sites, I do think that you're going to get a good training experience. So what's good enough in some cases relative to your other life situations that you have to take into account, and just to be really as aware of those as you can. I would again just reiterate the APIC directory is going to help you so much when you start looking at rotations, types of setting, types of clients. You might want to be looking at what types of supervisors. I just had a student ask me, I haven't, even though it's interesting, we have a lot of faculty of color and supervisors of color, for whatever reason, she hasn't gotten that yet in the program. So she's definitely wanting to go on internship someplace where she can be guaranteed a supervisor of color. So it can be down to those kind of specific levels. Certainly types of supervision you might want to get, types of modalities, all of that you want to just really be thinking about. And we, in our program, we try to build it in like there are self-reflection papers after a practica where they talk about what's the next steps, or in your annual evaluation, maybe you have that question, what's your professional goals for the next year? But if you don't have that built in, then you really need to start thinking in those ways, because that's going to affect not only where you're applying, but the types of things you're going to be writing about in your essays. So this is a good time to be doing that. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, great.
Can I say something?
I was just going to say, let me turn to the intern training directors. Yes, for your comments on interests and specifically for your sites, what are really relevant interests and so on. But Mike, you had a comment, yes.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on something Eve said. The APA accredited question, and specifically in the VA, you cannot work in a VA without an APA accredited internship, period. And it's written into federal law, so there's no exceptions.
Now,
so
I thought there was one exception, which is that if you're at a VA that is going for APA accreditation.
So I was just about to say that. Okay. So if a VA has a new internship program and you really have to be in internship for 2 or 3 years before you can apply for accreditation, that's the one exception. And so if it's a VA internship, it doesn't matter if it's APA accredited, but if you ever want to work for a VA ever, you have to have an APA accredited internship. And it's been kind of sad because I'm the one that does the hiring at our VA, and we've had some really good applicants for jobs who it turns out didn't have an APA accredited internship, and there's unfortunately just no exception to that. So I just wanted to make sure everybody knows that, because sometimes that's a surprise to folks. As far as the topic of interest, I agree with everything pretty much that you said. You need to look at if you're looking at VA programs, there's a lot of similarities among VA internship programs. We tend to have there's a lot of differences too, and there tends to be a pretty rigorous training program. It tends to be pretty structured, but there's some VAs pay a lot more attention to diversity education, to working with diverse clients. You need to think about when you're looking at sites. Are they in rural locations versus urban locations? What will the population be? And then you need to look at most sites are pretty good in their materials at describing their rotations. And so you just need to put yourself in the situation of, if I'm going to go to this site, what will my year look like? What kind of clients will I see? Are there 2 rotations, 2 6-month rotations, or 3 4-month rotations? And how will that? How many experiences can I get? The other thing about training interest and goals, you need to look at generalist programs versus programs with tracks. Our site is a very generalist site, and we advertise that. It's in all our materials. Everything about it says we're a generalist site, but we still get a lot of applicants every year who are way health focused, who are way neuro focused, who write everything. And even at a VA, sometimes we get people who write essays and apply who are all they talk about is PTSD and nothing else. And even though we're a VA, we do a lot more than just treat PTSD. So we want to see people with broad experience, as broad as you can get, and broad interests. So, and one question I always get, and I know someone's going to ask it tonight, is do people have to have ever worked at a VA to apply to a VA? And the answer is no. We match every year with a few interns who've never worked at a VA. But something equivalent, where people have worked with the severe mentally ill population, or worked with substance abuse, or worked with something that we see frequently in veterans, would be helpful. And those are my comments for now, and I'll chime in later.
Thank you, Mike.
And I think what I would say is that the goodness of fit is maybe the top issue for many internship programs, and certainly in hospital environments, which is where I am. And it's extremely helpful to look at an application and see that someone is aware that a hospital environment may be a little bit different than other environments, and ideally that the applicant will have had some exposure to working with medical teams. I think applicants would be well advised to look at the type of hospital, and because different hospitals will serve markedly different populations. Safety net hospitals, which is where I am, will have a pretty high percentage of people who are low income, and where social justice may be a really important component of what the internship can be about. But other types of hospital environments may be much more research oriented, and provide people who are participating in the program more time to participate in in a research activity as opposed to direct clinical work. I would also encourage people to look at the balance of assessment versus intervention that is expected, because that also could be really different from hospital to hospital. There's some hospitals where it may be 50-60% of what interns do is standardized assessments of clients, and other places where it may only be 10% or less of what applicants do.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. And then
So
Marianne.
Sure. I think related to counseling centers, again, it's kind of what Brittan said at the beginning of all of this, is to know where you're applying and really look at that website, and not necessarily that you've got to, oh, sorry, my light turns off automatically. They tell me it's time to go home. But, you know, the idea that I get a letter that says I really want to work in a VA, and I go, I don't think they've really read my website. Or, you know, they're emphasizing a lot of assessment, which is not our center. There are other centers that do. So it really is looking at, you can have very kind of concrete goals, but make sure that they fit where you're applying. And your interest certainly can be broad, and to be able to kind of have a mix of both, but to really look at what are the program strengths I'm looking at and how much do they fit my interests, is going to really, again, that would be, for me, a throw out. If you tell me in your letter that it's, you know, assessment heavy, or that, you know, you're wanting to do, you know, I'm neuropsych, I'm looking at that going, why are you applying to us? And I think that that's sometimes students will have a tailor letter that they use, and they're using that for multiple sites. Last year I had a record of 7 letters that came wrong, that they put a different training director. Some I knew, so I actually emailed them and told them I got their letters. And somebody told me that, you know, my name was on them. So those sound like simple things, but I have a committee of 9 people that are reading these. Some are real grammar crazy people. I am not. But when it's poorly written, I just watch my whole committee. It doesn't matter. They're stuck on the misuse of the word there. And it's like, did anyone proof this for this person? And especially what will happen is if you see one error, you'll see multiple errors. And again, those really are ones that we tend to set aside. And I know Marie, you know, kind of alluded to how many applications you get. You don't want to set yourself apart in a negative way. You don't want to be in that pile that I'm not even going to review because it's already gotten that far, where we're looking at that going, this person didn't have somebody proofread it or really reread it themselves.
I mean, that is really honest feedback about that. Yeah, Eve? Sorry.
You know, I just want to say, to me, that reinforces that idea of, do you have the time to commit the investment at this time? Because what happens is people are trying to do too much. They're juggling too many balls, and balls are getting dropped. That in those situations, they're either applying to too many places, or they're just not allowing enough time to do an adequate job of getting feedback and then doing a final read and edit.
Yeah.
And if I could say something, we also look at it as, or they're just not good writers, and we don't require any kind of testing sample or any kind of report to be sent to us because we found that's not very valid. People find their best one. But we rate people's writing quality. That's one of our rating things when we rate apps, and that's because we're going to be reading people's notes all year, we're going to be reading their assessment reports all year, and this is the writing sample we have to rate. So if you've got grammar problems in it, or incomplete sentences, or you're too casual with your writing, and you know, we note that.
Yeah.
I would add that the cover letter is going to be usually the first place that programs are going to look to make sure that there is a good fit between the applicant and the site. you know, with what Mike said, for example, knowing and being able to state in that cover letter what kind of rotations that the program has that are interesting to the applicant and that really fit in with that overall kind of professional life plan that they have. Sometimes I'll get cover letters that are really fairly cursory and I'm pretty sure are being written to numerous sites with very little change to that applies to what that particular site is, and often I'm not going to go any further in reviewing those applications.
Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to add something very quickly as well, is just trying to find the transferable skills once you identify the sites to which you want to apply, and knowing that certain programs have unique features, and to try to work those unique features in a way that is to better your application. So for instance, our program requires that we do a full year of assessment. So I finished that year with 31 integrative reports, and I only wanted to work at college university counseling centers where that could have been seen as somebody who is more clinically focused or focused more heavily on assessment, and that was not something I wanted to get out of internship necessarily. So I use that in a way where I can say that, you know, it really helped me to conceptualize clients quickly. It helped me to understand presenting concerns in a more complex way, and to offer recommendations and to work with treatment teams. So you find a way to work with the unique features of your program to find those transferable skills that you can put into all of your application materials, as well as to make those work as far as meeting the requirements or the expectations of each training site.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Can I say one other thing real quick, because I'm noticing in some of the questions that that it's not just about total number of hours. For instance, I think most places want, well, they might want, let's say, whatever total number of intervention or assessment hours. They're going to be looking very specifically, for instance, at intake. How many people have you actually screened and determined their, you know, they're getting the initial intake on? Is also, some sites will have a specific number they're looking for there, or in other areas as well. So it's a little more complicated than just, and you just want to make sure that as you're thinking about the site, what are the different duties you're going to be doing, and do you have some hours that would suggest you have at least some foundation in that area, and then of course the site will take that and refine your skills, kind of as Brittan was just talking about. Intakes or screening interviews are going to be pretty essential at most sites.
Mm-hmm. So let's get right to that question. You know, the whole thing of how much experience is enough for your site. So if each of the intern directors can speak directly about hours and then types of hours, types of experience, because I think that is one of the most commonly asked questions in the area that I know gives so much anxiety to students. So any words of wisdom would be much appreciated.
I would imagine that counseling centers are lower than the other two. I don't know, Brittan, if that was your experience in applying last year. Certainly our center is 350, and that's pretty standard. Of the counseling centers that are very large, that are kind of in the, I don't know what you call Texas, but the middle of the country, Midwest all the way, north and south. But I know California, the counseling centers are much higher because they're more competitive. And the East Coast, I don't know what you people do over there, but I imagine it's somewhere in between. But I've never seen a counseling center over 500 hours. Mm-hmm. I also would say...
By hours, are you meaning direct face-to-face? Does it count note-taking? Yes. What specifically counts as an hour?
Direct face-to-face. Outreach counts. I saw that question. I got a little distracted reading the question because that's direct service. And assessment. That will really vary from counseling center to counseling center. Some counseling centers are very assessment-heavy, and others aren't. So it really will vary based on the particular site that you're looking for.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
And then Chris and Mike, if you could comment a little bit on hours and all that piece of it, how much is enough kind of thing.
We're looking for a little bit more than that, and so we prefer for our applicants to have 600 direct face-to-face contact hours with intervention and assessment combined. I will say that although more hours is somewhat better than less hours, that at that point we are looking at the totality of the application, and so other factors can come into play to some extent if someone is slightly low on the hours.
And I'll say, a couple of people ask what's the rationale behind number of hours. We every year sit and reevaluate what our criteria are and what do we need to change and do we need to rate the applications differently. And what we look at interns that have done really well and interns that haven't. And we have found over and over again that the interns that have had problems on internship have been people with less hours. That has been a strong correlation that we found over the years, that when we've had interns that didn't do as well as others that didn't show up kind of ready to go, it's because they maybe applied a year too early and they just didn't have enough hours. I'll also say assessment hours are very important in VA sites. There's not going to be a VA site that I know of that doesn't have an assessment requirement. I also don't think there's a VA site that does mostly assessment. Assessment's usually 20-25% of what you do or less. But we get a lot of applications at our site. We get about 120 to 130 applications a year, and we take 6. And we're looking for reasons to cut because we have to narrow it down. And if we don't want to teach someone how to do a WACE, we don't want someone who for the very first time is doing an MMPI with us. We want to see people who've got some experience with real clients. And so something that's kind of scary about our site is we do a cut every year based just on numbers. So we put, and AFI has been very helpful because we used to have someone enter stuff into a spreadsheet for us to do this. But we actually will, and we don't have we have a minimum, but we don't have a minimum for a cut every year because it depends on the pool. So we just put everybody in and we look at their number of hours, their number of integrated reports, their number of WACEs, and their numbers of MMPI plus PAI. And we set a cut line, and everybody below the cut line never even gets looked at. Everyone above the cut line gets looked at very, very closely. We have at least 3 psychologists who read every app and rate 7 or 8 different areas. So we feel like we're spending a lot of time with you. Spend a lot of time on the app, so we spend a lot of time reading it and rating it, so that we can really narrow down. Because we don't want you to waste your time and money flying to Atlanta to interview if you're not going to stand up. So that's part of the reason. We spend a ton of time on the app, and that really varies by site. Some sites don't spend a lot of time with the apps, and it's a little more arbitrary, and some do. But as far as numbers are concerned, direct contact hours are important. A couple people have asked about terminal master's hours. Honestly, that varies among our raters. Some of our raters really spend a lot of time looking at terminal master's hours, and some see it more as a bonus because we're really more concerned with doctoral hours.
Thank you.
I'm curious if the other sites could talk about where they see master's hours. That'd be helpful.
At our site, we will take master's hours into consideration in that initial screen. But once you've gone past the initial screen, we do want to make sure that people have had an adequate amount of direct clinical work during their doctoral program as well. Another thing that I would add that we look at, and it's not just those total hours, but I will look pretty carefully at the tables in the specific clinical activities that the applicants are engaging in, that those seem to match up in a legitimate kind of a way with that total number of hours, because I do see applicants sometimes who have a fairly large, robust, what seems like a robust number of hours, but yet their clinical experience, at least in the areas that are relevant to our site, are not particularly robust, and so that opens up questions.
Marianne, did you have some comments about master's clinical hours?
Yeah, I think that really, again, varies based on what program. For us, we count them, and we just combine them. Because a lot of people in their master's programs do work at counseling centers. I think one of the things that's difficult for some academic programs is they don't have access to a counseling center where people can do a practicum. So I just answered the question about, is that a requirement? And it used to be, we used to require that, and then we realized that there are many schools, it's surprising, that they don't have access to being able to do counseling center work. And so it's more about showing that you want to work with this age group, that you understand the developmental issues, you understand kind of the culture that's going on right now with mental health and college students. And so what we have found is some people will get those hours in their master's and they didn't get them in their PhD, and we'll count them.
Right. Thank you. I'm thinking now might be a good time for Erica, because I think those questions are building. So let's spend just a few minutes on some of the student questions.
Sure. Yeah, I'm really glad that you addressed the question about hours, because it seems like a majority of the questions are about the hours. And I think you pretty much covered everything so far, except there's been a couple questions about, I guess, the timing of hours. Like, does the 500 need to be before applications are submitted, or is that a projection? Like, what's the timeline for that?
Ours, it's before.
It actually says on the API November 1st.
Yep. Yep. There's a place to kind of qualitatively report what you're going to be doing in the next year, but that doesn't go into the tables. And so what we download to do our cut is the stuff from the tables.
And
so
again, I'll just
by the end of this academic year, yeah.
Well, so what as the training director, you need to talk with your training director, because they have to verify those hours, and everybody has a different procedure. So some people use their programs use time to track, and it's done through that online platform. Others of us have spreadsheets where different supervisors over the course of time have signed off on hours. But what Chris was saying about, you know, whether or not hours add up, and most training directors DCTs take it very seriously about how to verify those hours, so that we can say legitimately, yes, this is the total number of hours that this person has done, and could, if asked, even say how many of those were individual counseling clients, how many were group, what was outreach, all of that. That should be usually well known to the training director, as well as for the student to be able to put it in the API.
And this is also a good time, I usually tell students, to put some of this stuff on Google Drive or Dropbox, because, you know, it does need to be de-identified, but it's one of those things that way you'll always know where your materials are, because you'll need these not just for internship, but you're going to need it for licensure, and, you know, especially if you move to another state in 10 years and you're going to go digging into your closet for all those logs. So if whatever you can put electronically available to you, of course, with whatever protected information you can, I really recommend that, because that way it's there. And there are services that, I mean, you can go through services. I'm forgetting Judy Hall used to, the National Service, there's a couple of national services you can actually put that information on. It does cost, so a very free way to do it is Google Drive or Dropbox and so on. So I really recommend that. Okay. Anything else, Erica, at this point that we want to address, or shall we move on to the actual API?
I think Danielle asked a good question about the role of your own personality in terms of fitting with an internship site. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
You know,
I think we can talk about that in the essays.
Okay.
Because that's where we're going to see it on the app, right? Is your personality is going to come across mostly in the essays.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, in these, we don't have on the agenda the actual interviews. You know, we kind of stopped with the written materials. And we tend to see more of that once they come to us.
I would agree with Mike that we look at the essays to get a sense of what people's kind of overall personality is, and maybe a little bit in the cover letter too. And one thing that applicants might want to do is, with the different essay questions, is to perhaps have a little bit of variation in the essays so that different aspects of your personality may be able to come through on different questions.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add to that that this goes back to you knowing what you're looking for too, because you know your personality, or hopefully you do, and you know what kind of sites that is more appealing to you, not just in terms of the type of site, but the vibe you get as you read about it, as you, especially as you get towards interviews and all that. So I think it is important to have a good sense of where do you feel like you'd flourish and thrive, and where do you feel like it might be kind of a rub for you instead. To the degree that you have a choice, you know, as it gets down to the match.
The other place where we can get a pretty good indication of what a person's personality is in the letters of recommendation. And that's one reason why it's very important to choose recommenders who you feel like know you, not just in terms of the purely professional side, but know a little bit of the kind of person you are and can include that in their letters.
And to get back to the question of how important is personality, it's very important. And you know that we're going to spend a year with you as an intern, and that's definitely something we're assessing. So I think getting your personality out there in an appropriate way is a very important thing. And we look at the interview more as assessment of goodness of fit than we do as you selling your credentials, because we've already spent a lot of time looking at your appy. We know what your numbers are. We know what your credentials are. We've seen your CV. We've seen your cover letter. We're really deciding, do we want to spend a year with this person? Are they willing to learn? Do they have things to learn? Do they know they have things to learn? Because we're not looking for well-rounded psychologists. We're looking for interns. We're looking for people that want to learn and who have good grounding and good potential to do that. But personality is, you know, very important. So I do think you need to think about that in all aspects of your app.
And it sounds like at least an openness to learning is a critical aspect of personality that is key. Are there other aspects of personality that you find are strikingly important, especially either positive and, you know, maybe some of the negative, but especially positive? What are some things that you really appreciate reading or learning about someone's personality?
You know, I think it's especially challenging for internship where you're going to try to say, this is what I have to offer and this is what I want to learn. And it's a balance, because right now our interns are going on job interviews. And I'll say, no, you know, don't present yourself like, you want to present yourself as, hey, this is what I have to offer you. But when you're doing it for an internship, I don't want to see that kind of letter. I want to see the letter of, I want to really learn from XYZ, I want to really grow in this area, I want to challenge myself here. So you want to present yourself as competent and skilled, but not that you've learned everything there is.
And that's where I think the self-reflection piece is important, that you know who you are, but also where you need to go next. So self-reflection to me would be a very important to be able to demonstrate.
Okay.
And in order to self-reflect or to help you in that process, definitely having those previous supervisors, advisors, mentors, anybody who you can sit with and process what it is that you want to write or how you want to write that. One of my dear friends, peer in the program, she and I have difficulty talking about areas of strengths where we can really talk about all of the areas of growth. And what we did is we took turns offering each other what we see as strengths in each other, and we just had this really open dialogue which helped us process how we can maybe write that in our materials, because that's what other people see in us that maybe we're not able to see in ourselves right now.
That's cool.
I think I can summarize. We want high openness, we want high conscientiousness, we want low neuroticism.
Can you send those my way, Mike? The ones.
How about the agreeableness?
Yes, high agreeableness for sure.
Okay. Erica, any other questions that you'd like to bring forward at this point?
There still seems to be some confusion about what constitutes a direct hour. I know outreach was addressed, but supervision was asked, and intake also was asked. So I don't know if there's insight on that or a list people can go to clarify.
Yeah, this is where it's going to be really important. I mean, we can go into some specifics here, but the API, when you can look at that online starting, I think, in July, and I'm a little concerned that people don't know it already, because they really should have been keeping track of their hours by those categories already. But you really want to become very familiar as soon as possible, because you're going to have to go back. If you don't know them already, you're going to have to go back and convert all your master's hours as well as the doctoral hours into these very specific categories. Like within, individual therapy, you got it at different age groups, and group therapy and couples therapy, and I mean, it's very specific.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, it's quite clear on the API exactly what an hour is and how it counts.
Whether it's direct or not.
Okay.
Yeah, but I know some people will get into it, and maybe this is part of what they're asking is, if it's half an hour, what do they count, and there is a little bit sometimes, like for instance, when if you're consulting with another professional, like someone who is, let's say, you're at a university counseling center and you're consulting with the nurse practitioner at the campus health, does that count as a consultation that's a direct service, or is that a case consultation hour that is actually in the support activities? So
this is where we rely on the training directors to certify the hours, and help categorize that for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Anything else, Erica, at this point?
Are there specific questions related to that you want to give us, Erica?
No, I think it's been pretty straightforward, a clarification of what constitutes a direct hour. There's questions about letters of reference, but I figured we'll get to that later. There's a couple questions about couples match, but I figured that would be better for the unique concerns for counseling psychology students, perhaps. But I think we've pretty much covered everything else.
There's just one other thing I'll just say related to the assessment, because I think this gets confusing as it relates to direct service. So when you're doing, for instance, a WACE and the face-to-face time with the person you're doing the assessment with, those are hours that count towards in the assessment area. So it has to be the face-to-face hours. The hours actually spent writing a report are actually in the support activities. And a lot of people think, oh my gosh, I've lost all these hours that a lot of time I spent on assessments aren't actually being counted. But I do think you just have to recognize there's a spot in which you're talking about the face-to-face hours, and then there's another part in the API where you actually are listing the number of WACEs or the number of MMPIs. So even though the MMPI is not going to give you face-to-face hours, the time spent having done an MMPI will certainly be recorded elsewhere, and a certain number of those will be very important to internship sites. So those are two separate ways of recording your activities.
Okay, so let's get to the API. And Eve, you do sound like you have quite the encyclopedic knowledge of that application. So let's just talk a little bit about it, because you had mentioned to do that. So other things you'd like to mention about the API, Eve, and anybody else?
Yeah, the one thing I would just say is that
I'm just getting my light to turn on again. It's timing out every so often, so I have to move.
All
right.
That's how they know we're alive. Okay.
You actually have to register in the online API on the APIC website. So there's two things you ultimately register for. One is the API, the online application process, and the other is the National Matching Service, the ability to get matched. The only one you have to do right away is the API one in order to get in and start filling out those hours, for instance. You have to be registered in that system. You actually should probably hold off on registering for the match, which is the organization that actually does the match is different than the API. They come together, but they're a separate organization, and there's a separate website to do that at. And you don't want to do that until you get the final go-ahead from your faculty, because once you're in the match, then that affects the university or program, because you'll look as withdrawn from the match if you decide not to go forward. So you kind of wait till later in the fall to do the match registration, but you don't want to forget to do that, because otherwise you're not going to get matched. So, but the API is just the online application, and that is where you're going to put in all your hours, put in all your different experiences. You're going to upload your vita. You're going to ultimately put your essays in there. Your reference writers will be come from there. The other thing is transcripts. You need to get your graduate transcripts put into that system as well. And I think is there. Oh, and sometimes there's supplemental materials that you'll have to. That particularly I think the only thing now is a assessment report or a case report. Is there any other supplemental materials that are that someone can ask for? There.
I had a case conceptualization.
Case conceptualization, yeah.
Although APIC says that that's highly discouraged, but some sites do it anyway.
Right. So just as it relates to the letters of reference, I would just, as you're hearing, those are very important. People really see them as a way to get to know the applicants better, and so you want someone that not only can write you a strong letter, because that's one of the things you should ask, but who can write a detailed letter. Because I've had people, I get feedback from internship directors who say, well, it was very positive, but it didn't tell us much about that person. So I think it's really important to get people who can speak in some detail, particularly about your therapeutic skills or your assessment skills, some element of the skills you'll be doing on internship, as well as be able to speak to your character and personality and that sort of thing.
And it's my understanding that this year the letter of reference has gotten really quite specific. At least that's what I heard from colleagues who were actually expressing some concerns, because it kind of, it's very directive now in terms of what letter writers need to address.
Right.
And this is something I've seen evolve over 10 to 15 years, where it used to be very generic, very open, when I started out as a faculty member, and now it's like super, super specific. And I know part of that comes from, just people just get bad experiences with certain folks that show up at the sites. And so like what the letter said and what was represented in the person was not matched. And so I've just seen it over the last 15 years that it's gotten really quite specific in terms of what letter writers need to provide. So you're choosing. Make sure you choose somebody who has specific things to say, can be constructive but not destructive, but not afraid to be constructive, because it seems more and more that's what internship sites want. And I will say, as a letter writer, I have a little hesitation about how constructive to be on paper, because what comes off on paper can sound a lot stronger or more negative than, say, if I were having a face-to-face with Chris or Marianne and saying, well, the student blah-de-blah. So I know that's just something that has evolved with the process.
Yeah, I have a couple things if we're talking about letters. Number one, I find them to be the least informative thing in the application, because generally people have found letter writers who will say glowing things about them, and we rate them on a scale of 1 to 5 each letter, and it's rare that it's not a 5, because people find someone who's going to say, oh, they're great, and their scholarship's great, and their therapy skills are great, and they're fun to be around. But I hate the new format with a passion. It's harder to read from my point of view. There's less, you can put less personality in there, I think, as a letter writer. Not that I've had to use it since I'm at a site, but what I used to do a lot was look for code where someone's saying good things about somebody, but really it's kind of a backhanded compliment, because if you see something in a letter that stands out, that's very, very constructive, it's very, very like this is a problem with the person, and you especially see it in more than one letter, that's just not very common. It's mostly glowing letters, because the people who are writing it know, like, they're recommending him for internship, so this isn't the place to point out their flaws. And so my advice to people, and some letter writers don't like this, but my advice has always been ask if you can read your letter. And I had a personal experience with, and if a person says, I never let anyone read letters ever, then don't argue with that. But if someone let other people read letters but won't let you read yours, that's a problem. You don't want to use them. And I had an experience where one of my supervisors was notorious for writing bad letters, and my classmates told me that, people in the class above me told me that, and so he wrote me a letter, and I wanted to see it, and I actually went back and told him he had to revise it or I wasn't going to use him, and he did. You know, so that can be a good thing if you have a good relationship with a supervisor. And of course, it's all going to be very supervisor specific. But my generic advice is read your letters in advance if your person will let you. Because and if you have a good, you know, think about it from the training director point of view. If they're reading this at the site, what are they going to see?
Mm-hmm.
So I was on the chair councils that recommended using this form back when I was president of ACTA 5 years ago, and it was because the letters had become so generic and not giving any information, just what Mike said. And it was based on the Canadian form that they had been using, and when I got it this year, I never remembered it being that long, that detailed, that, I mean, it was I don't know where they got it. But what ended up happening is we had our sections that we liked, and we just didn't read the rest. And it was pages that we didn't read. And so this year when they had the council chairs meeting again, all the training council chairs, it is completely revised for next year, and it is much smaller. It is just sections. It does give you the freedom, Marie, to write open-ended kind of what you want, but it also is, it kind of forces the letter writer to say more than a developmental they need to grow. Like where, I think how they phrased it is something about, you know, where have you seen this student change the most? So kind of trying to be pro for the student's growth, but also informative for the site. And that's, you know, I'm not going to defend it, but we liked the certain sections of it, and then we literally didn't read any of it. So next year it is, I think, about 1/4 the size.
Yeah, it's
awesome.
better.
That's great. That's good to hear, Marianne. And as I said, you know, program faculty totally get how this process has unfolded, having written my share of glowing letters. But I know it's so crucial that we be able to match people, and that faculty can be honest with each other and respectful. And so I appreciate this and so for the students online, just to know that even the application process has evolved over many years and will continue to evolve, just as things come up, and then the councils meet and they discuss and they make changes, really important ones. And so it's like, you know, chapter 57 of a very long play. So so even though you may have this year's APPE already, make sure that as soon as the APPE is ready for next year, as you're just hearing now, there are important changes that are coming. And so just always to be updated and current with whatever year application you're going to be doing.
I just want to note that in the chat box I did put the link to or the web address for the registration for the match, the registration for the APPE, as well as how you can subscribe to the match news at APIC, so you can get updates about when that sort of stuff starts to happen.
Excellent. And then Eve also put a really helpful book from APAGS on how to apply for internship, and that is really an extremely useful resource. Mm-hmm. Okay.
I would encourage the applicants to set timelines for themselves as to when they're expecting to complete the various pieces of the APPE, and give yourself a lot of time, particularly on the essays and the cover letter, to make sure that you get those pieces completed, because they can take a lot longer than you expect, and also that there's plenty of time to have several people review those.
Yeah, very important. Okay, in terms of any other general comments about the APPE? Otherwise, shall we just talk about the logs, and again, turning to Brittan and Eve about words of advice about the logs, and your own experiences with that. And maybe let's start with Brittan.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just best to start as soon as you start seeing clients and to keep up with it. That's what I did. I used Time to Track. It was a requirement of our program, and then they switched to My Psych Track, but both were pretty compatible. So I never let there be a lapse in keeping track of any of my hours. And I know that that saved me a lot of time to really focus on other things that are incredibly important, such as the essays and the cover letters, because the hours, if you're not keeping track of them, as Dr. Adams mentioned, can be quite a hassle to go back through all of your records to try to figure out the details of even just individual counseling or assessments. How many assessments did I offer? How many hours did I spend doing certain activities? So definitely keep track of that as you go along, and find a way in which you're able to know what those hours mean, whether that's purchasing a membership with MyPsychTrack or Time to Track, or doing an Excel sheet like Dr. Adams mentioned. So definitely keeping up with logs is something that I highly recommend. I know it saved me a lot of headaches.
Yeah, and I'll just add, and I'll put a link to our webpage, the NMSU webpage, where we have an Excel spreadsheet which you're welcome to download. It's formatted as the API is formatted. So if you can't afford type, because I think it's at least $100 or something like that. Is that right?
It's very affordable. So programs are able to get MyPsychTrack, so we didn't have to pay for MyPsychTrack, and Time to Track, I think, is $35 a year. So for me, that was very affordable for
yeah, right. Yeah, right. So, but I'll put that in there. But the other thing I just want to emphasize is that it's not just hours. They're going to ask you. Part of the API is how many different types of clients you've had. So the demographics of age, their age ranges, their ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation. So as you can see, it just very quickly snowballs into a very big amount of...
An avalanche, yeah.
Yeah. And definitely start talking to your supervisors along the way as far as what certain hours count as. So I see a lot of questions coming up as far as what activities are involved in case management, or whether or not intakes count as assessments, or whether they count as intervention. Definitely talk to your supervisors along the way, because those will be people who will give you those answers, as well as your director of clinical training in your program as well. So don't wait. Just try to, when you have questions related to hours, ask them as soon as you do, so that you don't log things incorrectly.
And there's also at APIC, there is someone whose job is just to answer questions about the API, and so you can also contact them as well. So, and I believe it's, yes, Dr. Self, Mariella Self is the person that is currently if you go to the section that says API help, at the very bottom, the online support content, implementation, or use of the online API online, please contact Dr. Self, and list an email address there.
And from the internship directors, any kinds of tips, ideas, comments about logs, other than do them? Okay. All right. Essays. Brittan, may I ask you first to talk a little bit about your experiences with the essays?
Sure. So this goes with everything else I've already said. Don't wait. Try to start thinking about what you want in each of those essays as soon as possible, so that you're able to go through several drafts. Know individuals who will be able to give you really helpful feedback, both on not only the content, but also the way in which it might be coming across. As some individuals have mentioned, how you put things in writing might sound very different as somebody's reading it. And you really want to make sure that your personality is congruent with who you are. So have a lot of people read your materials, as well as be able to take that feedback. That's part of this process as well. So it's not always the easiest to take, because I really wanted to make sure that all of my presentations were on my CV, because I felt connected to each of them, but it was strongly advised that I take some of them off, so that it's selected presentations, selected publications. So really being able to take the feedback that's being offered, because as long as you can really confide in those individuals and you know that they're out for your best interest, and and then also finding individuals who have served in the role of a training director at any facility. So I had the wonderful opportunity of having Dr. Julia Phillips, who is now one of our training directors, who had been a training director for a counseling center for years, give me a lot of useful feedback as far as how to present my materials in a way that I wanted them to be presented.
I will just emphasize again, no one should submit any part of this whole process without someone else looking at it, even if it's just a colleague, but really you should be having faculty who are knowledgeable about the process. And that's the other thing. There are some faculty who aren't really up to date on what is really being asked of you all in the application process and what internships sites are looking at. So I think you want to make sure you're asking the right person too to give you feedback, whether it's about the essays or your CV or even the application logs that you're completing.
One of the most difficult aspects of this, or challenging, is you be prepared to get different kinds of feedback. So you might have somebody say, oh yeah, you selected whatever, and others like, oh no, you should put it all in there. So, and this happened to me when I was a student, and I know it's something every year I hear students talk about, and that's sort of like a beginning of the entrance into the work world, because there's multiple perspectives, multiple opinions, and that's where it goes back to what Eve is suggesting, and Brittan as well, is you have your go-to folks you've had all the time. Generally speaking, the training director of all the faculty should be the most up-to-date. If you're in the process of a transition to a newer training director, certainly the former training director is going to be also available most commonly. So it's just one of those things. Just be prepared that you may get a mixture of feedback, but if you get an overwhelming opinion on something, I certainly would listen to it.
The one other thing I'd like to say, just in terms of the essays in general, is what I tell my students is to actually write a longer, the essays are 500 words, but write a longer essay to begin with, because often you can distill down to 500 words, but you wouldn't have got to some of the real nuggets had you not started with a bigger essay, and not necessarily 1,000 words, but don't worry too much about the word limit as you write your first draft or two. That can always be condensed, and the most essential parts, the most useful parts, can then be refined at that point.
Okay. And then another component that I wanted to add is when you're looking at fit, to make sure that that fit is true to you. So don't try to make yourself be somebody you're not. So I can't emphasize that enough, that I really felt as though I could fit at any of the sites to which I applied, and I would have been happy at any of them, because I really wanted to find sites that were a great fit for me, and that made me present myself in a very authentic and truthful way. And then another piece about the logistics of writing, I printed out all my materials before I sent any of them, because I'm very visual, so I had to go through and read, and I found errors in every cover letter, every essay before I sent it, and they were some minor errors, but I really wanted to make sure that my materials were seen as something that I took much care in preparing. So I took the extra time to go through and review and review and review, even after they had been through several reviews of faculty and peers.
And I would say even the best writers, three drafts would be the minimum, I would say, for any of these essays.
You certainly
just to catch all those. Yeah.
You certainly don't want typos to be something that trips you up.
Mike, you've been trying to say something for a bit.
Yeah, so as far as content of the essays, the questions I get a lot is how much do I be myself versus how much, am I, and one of the things, you're going to get different advice on this from different people, and I will say that different raters at our site have different opinions. So on the autobiographical, I saw someone put a question earlier, do you want a professional biography or a personal biography? And I will say that even amongst our raters, people have different opinions on that. Some people want to know, want to hear about, and it depends. It depends on your story. You know, if you have a unique story, so I had an applicant last year who wrote about how she grew up on a military base and it made her really want to work with veterans, and she had moved around, and there was just a lot of rich personal history that she was able to spin around and then talk about psychology and how she chose psychology and how that ended up her wanting a VA internship. That was very good. And my basic advice is to be yourself, but make sure you're showing that you have good boundaries. Because it's usually not the time to talk about your personal therapy. It's usually not the time to talk about, because what some people are looking at, it's not that we don't expect that grad students have been through therapy or that people have had struggles, because you know most people have. Everyone's had some kind of struggle. It's just that if you're focusing on that in your autobiographical statement, we're going to be asking why. Like, why is that so forward here? Does that mean this person doesn't have good judgment, that they're writing to a vast training committee and giving a whole lot of interpersonal detail? So I think you've got to put some of your own personal flavor in there, and what I personally like to see is a balance of a little bit of personal stuff that then goes into the more professional, like why do I want to be a psychologist, why did I choose this field, and if it's just personal and doesn't tell me why they want to be a psychologist, then I may know a little more about them, but I don't know why they want to come to my site. And if it's just, you know, I entered grad school and you don't mention anything before that, then I don't know that much about you, and I haven't seen that personality or that flavor. So to me personally, I think you do a balance in the autobiographical statement, and you also look at how the other essays talk about your personality, your interests, because there's a lot of place in the diversity essay, there's a lot of place, you know, in the theoretic orientation essay. I don't just want to see, and so I got one more thing about the theoretic orientation essay. I can't tell you how many times I've seen the words biopsychosocial model, and that's it, and not a whole lot more. I want to see people really know how to conceptualize a case, and whenever possible, I want to see why that fits for the person. You know, how did they get there? And sometimes that's a case example, sometimes that's, you know, and some people go with a case example to show they know how to conceptualize from a theoretic orientation. I think that's good. And if you're just writing generic, I'm CBT and I do a biopsychosocial assessment and blah, 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 you're going to look just like everybody else who's applying. So you need to show that you've used it with a case, why you find it the way to go. And we personally don't discriminate against people from different orientations, but we just want to see you have one, and that it's well developed, and kind of how you got there.
Thank you, Mike. And I know there was a question earlier, which is how important is a specific theoretical orientation match to a site? And Mike, you said it's not that terribly important. You just want to be well reasoned in your thinking as you respond to this. And how about for Chris and Marianne?
At our site, it also is not something that is crucial that someone have a particular theoretical orientation. We have different faculty members who have different theoretical orientations. We prefer, as Mike said, that someone has a theoretical orientation that they can articulate and indicate something about why that's been effective for them in the work that they do.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, you know, Mike answered that perfectly. You know, you don't have to teach me what CBT is. I don't need you to give me book quotes. I don't need, you know, references to articles defining your theoretical orientation. That's not what I'm looking for. It's not a prove to me you understand this theoretical orientation. It is, how do you use it? And are you open? You know, sometimes people will write their theoretical, like they're done. Their journey's over. They've discovered it, and this is what they do. And so I want to see that you understand there's flexibility, and sometimes that essay becomes a little too rigid, and so that becomes something that we're looking at as well. We really like a case example and some case conceptualization based, obviously, on the case. That goes a long way in our reviewers' minds. Our reviewers also, just what Mike said, you know, I might like an autobiography statement and I have somebody else on the committee that doesn't like it as much. You do want to find that balance of letting us know you a little bit. If it's just too academic, that is really, especially at our site here, that's not what we're about. You know, we talk about the use of self, but the use of self isn't telling us about your therapy. It's how do you connect with either the field of psychology in your autobiography statement, or your theoretical orientation, or your worldview, which would then go into your diversity or your multicultural question. You know, kind of the complexity of a person is kind of how we want to see it. And I think sometimes that's difficult because you're trying to balance being professional as well as share this personal information. But if you can keep in your kind of your thoughts about, yes, it is your personal, but always bring it back to your work. How do I bring it back to my work? How does it connect with who I am? Look at that. I am outstanding with my light turning off on me. And it does it every time I talk, so I'm wondering if there's somebody else in the building with me. But just that idea of being able to connect it back to your work, that's really what we're going to want to see. Another question that relates to the essays, Marie, that I read when I was looking through was, how do you set yourself apart in an essay, and kind of how do what are we looking for? Again, in the counseling center world, it has changed drastically in the last 3 to 5 years. And if you start talking about strongs and doing career and vocational, that's not going to hit where we are. We had 7 hospitalizations last week in 2 days. There's a lot of counseling centers that we feel like we're mental health clinics, and obviously mine is, you know, a university that's incredibly large of 60,000 students. But even here, in the last 3 to 5 years, the amount of students that want to get in, the level of anxiety, the pressures, the suicide rates have increased drastically. All these things that are unique to counseling centers, that's what's going to stand you. You're going to stand out. You can do a prac at a counseling center and you see your clients and you do your thing, but if you get immersed in the culture, you're going to see the center struggle with, how do we handle when we have a 3-week wait for a first-time appointment? What are we doing with our university police department having multiple trips to our front desk, and how are we managing our waiting room? These things that we're on the fly trying to figure out, that sets you apart.
And I don't know, I was going to say, Marianne did this amazing presentation about counseling centers and how they're changing, even something like sleep deprivation. You spoke about CCPTB, you know, that students these days are used to like 2 hours of sleep, and so by the second week of this kind of life, they look, you know, disheveled and can't put 2 thoughts together and so on. So yeah, as Marianne is saying, the context of the university counseling center, it just has so changed in the last 20 years. And so I don't know, Marianne, if there is any kind of references or anything that you can provide, and we certainly can have Erica and Brittan share that with SAS students of how to update, what are some good ways or resources that students can immerse themselves a little bit more specifically to counseling centers. And of course I know Mike and Chris also have things to say, but I think that's really important too, to be very current with what is going on in the context. And
all you have to do is Google the Chronicle of Higher Ed, and there was an article called "The Angst of the College Student," and it summarized everything of what counseling centers are facing. And Brittan, you're nodding away. Do you know the article I'm talking about?
I do. Yeah, I find sometimes those articles, and even just news articles, the most helpful. So I definitely looked up news articles related to each college university counseling center to which I applied and then interviewed, so that I knew what specific issues they were wrestling with. So if there were a lot of suicides on campus the year prior to when I applied, I wanted they handle that. And sometimes just reading the campus newsletter, even though it's a very skewed view, it still can allow you to inform questions you may have as well as just seeing the global trend that students in general at college university counseling centers, the experiences are very different than they were even 10 years ago, and that the severity as well as the intensity of the work has changed, and that there's also very long wait lists, and policy is definitely impacting the work that is done, particularly Title IX and sexual assaults and other things. So become as knowledgeable as you possibly can without just relying heavily on literature, scholarship. Also look at news and policies and other things that are informing the work that you will be doing.
And I was just going to say, and that's where it's also really important, if you can get a practicum or field experience placement at a counseling center, you're more likely to know some of that because of your work there.
Mike, did you have something you were waiting
I was going to get back to two things that I thought of about the essays, specifically the theoretical orientation essay. Number one, if you say you're integrative and your theoretical orientation is integrative, that's fine, but let me know what you're integrating. Because some people say I'm integrative, but they don't say what. And so I don't know that they know what integrative means. That may just mean they don't have a theoretical orientation and they just cherry pick interventions, which leads to my second point, which is I do evidence-based psychotherapy is not a theoretical orientation, and dialectical behavior therapy is not a theoretical orientation. And I've seen that on several, things. It's like people say, well, DBT informs everything I do, and I say, well, that's a specific treatment for a specific disorder, and it can apply to other things, but it can't be your sole theoretical orientation. So those are some errors I've seen where people they say they're integrative and they don't say what they're integrating, or they just focus so much on technique or evidence-based practice or something like that that I still don't know that they know how to theorize or conceptualize a case.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Mike or Chris, in terms of the context of working at the VA or working in a hospital setting, a medical care setting, what are some current pressing issues that you're facing, even relative to changes that have happened in the last 10 or 20 years? For example, the Affordable Health Care Act, I know, has had a major impact.
Well, I would say that there's lots of change that has gone on over the last 2 years, and probably there will be more change that will be happening very rapidly, and that is a reason why it's very helpful for people to have had experience in a healthcare, in a hospital or a medical setting that's been fairly recent, to be able to show that they know what that environment is like. And there are many more people who are eligible for insurance now, and so there's been a lot of increase in the staff, both on the medical side as well as on the psychology side, that are at many medical facilities. So I know at our place and at other places in our area, there's a shortage of office space for people to be able to use to see clients, and their staff have transitioned often from having their own offices to occupying cubicles, at least for some of the time. So moving into more of what a medical, like a primary care setting might look like, with pods where providers would sit perhaps together with psychologists and social workers and physicians and nurse practitioners. And so we're looking in the application for some indications that people are pretty flexible and can get along well with others and work as part of a multidisciplinary team. And one thing I wanted to say is going back to how you can set yourself apart, which was the question that came up recently. I mean, I think that's where you ought to be conceptualizing the application as showing that you have an understanding of how the art and the science aspects of this fit together for you, and that ought to, that everyone who's applying for an internship has been involved in this field and preparing themselves for where they are now for years. And so somewhere in those essays and the cover letter, I think some indications that those things do fit together for people, that it's not a formulistic sort of a thing, but people have their own particular way that they do it that really integrates both of those aspects. I think is really important.
And this, as far as recent developments in the VA, the office space thing, definitely the thing. So the VA obviously has been in the news a lot. In the past several years, we've had some scandals, we've had access problems. Luckily, a lot of what those access problems have led to in mental health is a lot of hiring. So I've hired, I think, 27 psychologists in the last year, and that's a record for our VA. We have 115 psychologists, and our VA in 2002 had 9. So we've grown at an exponential rate in mental health, and I think we are an extreme version of that because our VA in 2002 was really lousy when it came to mental health, and now we're really good at it. But VAs across the country have grown a lot. So there's a lot of new staff, there's a lot of young staff, because a lot of people we've hired are coming off internship or postdoc. The space challenges are an issue because we haven't gotten new buildings, so we've gotten new staff without new buildings, so people have had to be creative with that. Another, the two big things I'll say about the VA that aren't obvious, I mean, the PTSD is obvious, but the other one is veteran suicides. There's a lot of press about that, and it's because it's a real issue, and we spend a lot of time focusing on suicide. We spend a lot of time on safety planning. We over-outreach our folks if they no-show. So there's a lot of things going on with suicide prevention. But the other big thing that the VA hasn't gotten a lot of press for is, and this almost every VA has got some internship training on this, is primary care mental health integration. And primary care mental health integration is where we actually put psychologists and then therefore trainees embedded in primary care clinics. So, and people are generally half scheduled, half unscheduled to see walk-ins. So if any veteran walks into any primary care clinic and expresses a mental health concern, they can see somebody that day. And it's a great experience, and I think it's something people don't think of when they're thinking of VAs, because in our interns this year, almost all of them are doing something in PCMHI because they're all excited about it. And it's assessment and short-term therapy, and the goal is to keep people in the primary care environment if they don't need to go to general mental health, or they don't need to go to our trauma program. If some people have an adjustment disorder or readjustment to society issues, they're going through a divorce, we actually do 5 or 6 sessions of brief therapy in primary care, and that's applicable to so many places, and it's equivalent to what some college counseling centers do. Some college counseling centers have a really short-term model. And someone asked a question about, does my internship have a lot to do with my first job? And we've hired a lot of people for PCMHI programs from college counseling centers. That's a pretty equivalent experience a lot of times. And so I agree with, being able to work with a multidisciplinary team, being able to talk to people from different professions, being able to get along, being able to have the confidence, to walk into a clinic and talk to an MD or a social worker. Not that you need to know everything, but you need to at least be able to come and talk and ask questions and things like that. I think that's really important in our sites.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. And that was a fantastic question about what sets your application apart, because look at the kind of dialogue that really generated. So I'm got my eye on the time. We have about 20 minutes left. So we've got letters of reference. I think we did talk about program approval already pretty extensively. I don't think we have too much left. And then unique concerns for counseling psychology students. So let's go to letters of reference. And I think there's been a number of questions about that, but Brittan and Eve, sort of how you approached letters and letter writers, and what were some of the things that you considered in approaching people?
Mm-hmm. I would say for me it was just individuals who I had a very strong relationship with, and fortunately for me that I've had very positive relationships with all of my supervisors, so it wasn't very difficult as far as finding individuals who would write not only positive letters but also those that would also highlight those areas of growth. because we all have them, and I recognize, you know, that I have various areas of growth as well. And there was dialogue around what my supervisors had intended on writing prior to writing it, so that we had an open discussion, which also helped me form or remind myself of my own growth over the years. So some of those supervisors were from year 1, and now I'm year 5 in the program, so it allowed me to see how I've grown in some of those areas, as well as where I still need to grow. So I tried to have as much open dialogue as possible, and I think that it's also the individuals who I worked with who were open to that. And all of my supervisors offered, I didn't have to ask them, sending me what it is that they had written. So I heard Dr. Martin say that that will vary depending on the supervisors as to whether or not they will share that. But I don't know if Dr. Adams has any specific feedback as far as who to ask.
Yeah, I think the one thing to make sure you know is that you don't have to have all the same letters for all the same sites. The nice thing about the API is that you designate however many people you want as letter writers, and you certainly don't want to go overboard on that because people are taxed with what they can do. But if you know strategically that you want these 3 letter writers for, let's say, university counseling centers, and then some overlap, but maybe 2 of those people are going to be for all your sites, but there's one person who was your supervisor at a university counseling center, so you want them in that one. But if you're also applying to health settings, then someone who maybe supervised you in the behavioral health practicum or something like that. And so once those letters go into the system, then you pick. You don't see them in the system, which is why it's important to ask if you can see them elsewhere. But you designate which of those letters go to which site. So I think it is really important to be very strategic about who's going to be able to paint the best portrait of you for specific sites. Some people, most people will use their advisor just because that's someone who has seen you over, you know, your entire time in graduate school, or at least in the doctoral program. But you know, I would say beyond that, you really don't want folks that are providing reference letters who can't speak very directly to your skill set at least in general as a therapist, and then more specifically for sites. Brittan brought up that point of, you know, someone who's seen you in your first prac. Now, if that was a great relationship and they're going to write you a really glowing letter, that's great. But I think someone often who's seen you more recently and can speak to your ability to see more complex cases, for instance, is probably a more important letter to get, at least for some sites. So, but it really is. It's kind of, it depends on who can write you the best letter and the most detailed letter. Though that's going to be, to me, the most important things. And then if you can get people who can speak to a specific site on top of that, I think that's great to do if you can make that happen.
Right. And also building off of that is know that each program handles things differently. So our program requires that we can master's already in clinical mental health. So even though it was my first practicum, I had had several years of clinical practice prior to. So I wouldn't have asked somebody from my master's to write one of those letters of recommendation. But also Dr. Adams brings up a really good point about organization as well. So know what particular sites ask for, because there will be sites that are very specific, saying that they want one letter to come from your faculty advisor, or they want one letter to come from your dissertation chair, and they want them to come from specific people. So don't wait until the last minute and recognize that, and then have to ask, say, your faculty advisor or your dissertation chair at the last minute to write you a letter of recommendation because it's required at that particular site. So to try to be as organized as possible, but definitely to choose individuals who can speak to the complexity of the cases that you're able to handle is definitely something you want to consider.
And the one other thing I'd add is that there's also a spot for the training director to write additional they're in effect writing somewhat of a letter in that training director part of the application process. So for instance, as a training director, I'm writing both letters of recommendation, and then I'm writing my training director letter, and it varies for different.
To answer regarding that. Somebody asked, what about letters from master's level supervisors who act under our doctoral level supervision? Is this a no-no? The master's level had more contact and therefore knows more about my work.
I wouldn't like that. I mean, that would stand out to me as what's been going on the last 3 years, that you're going that far. I would be curious why I would want their academic. I always like a letter from the academic chair of their dissertation to kind of have a connection of their research and their, understanding of what they're doing related to their dissertation. And I really want a primary supervisor or somebody that has seen their work. And it doesn't have to be counseling center; it can be anywhere. But just as long as they've seen their work.
I think this person's asking about if the person's a master's level provider who's supervising them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Oh, we would accept that. That'd be great. That'd be fine.
But Mary Ann's point is still cogent. I mean, the more recent the letter writer, the better, and definitely somebody from your doctoral program. But yeah, it doesn't. I think it's an okay one. That's a yes.
I think it would be fine, but I think there may be some people who review it who would wonder why you couldn't find, But I understand. Like I had a practicum site where I was supervised by nothing but master's level people, and I had 2 actually. And so, if I really wanted someone who supervised me on site, it would have been a master's level person.
Okay.
Let me ask a question. Can I just ask a question to the training directors, internship training directors? Because this is a question I often get on a number of things. How would you feel about an applicant contacting you by email to ask that question specifically to you? Is it okay if I provide a letter from, let's just say in that example? How do you all feel about getting those kind of questions directly? Because they are so site-specific, the answers are often so site-specific.
I don't mind.
I don't mind as long as there is a specific question that has a clear rationale for asking. And one other thing I would like to say about the letters of reference, which, I mean, overall most letters are very positive, and so they do tend to kind of blend into each other. They can hurt you if people don't say positive things about you. I think in terms of the strengths for the strong letters, it can be helpful to have letter writers who can comment on different aspects of your professional work. And so if you have people have your someone from your academic program I think for hospital settings, we would prefer to have at least one of the letter writers who knows the applicant from outside of their academic program from working with them in a direct clinical supervision situation.
Yeah, I understand that the people from the academic site supervise their clinical work, but they don't often know the intricacies of the site, and they haven't been there beside them actually seeing how they function in the clinic. So I think it is important to have at least one letter be from someone outside the academic program. It's not a must, it's not a complete, we're going to rule you out based on that, but it definitely, having worked beside them in a clinical capacity gives you a different view than the clinical supervisor on campus. As far as people emailing me with questions, it doesn't happen very often, and if it started happening very often, it would start taking up a lot of my time. And I'm not the training director anymore, so it probably wouldn't come to me, but I was the training director for many years, and I can't remember getting very many emails like that. So, you know, as long as it's a very specific, focused question that I could answer quickly, and it didn't seem like an attempt to butter me up or look, you know, because I think sometimes you can read between the lines and say, ah, this person's trying to get their name in my head. I think if it's a very focused question, like Chris said, I think it would be okay.
One thing that I've had occasionally is someone who wants to apply for an internship who asks if they can come by to visit and see our site outside of the interview process, and that I do not particularly appreciate because I think it's not fair to the other applicants.
And Erica, are there any other letter questions about letters that we might want to address that you see from the students?
I think you guys do a really good job of checking in and covering them. It seems like the question of who should we reach out to beyond someone who will speak positively of us, and the drawbacks and benefits of focusing on clinical supervisors versus academic advisors, and I guess how much weight the training director does hold in their letter, and then when can you access these letters so that they can start to notify their letter writers, or pretty much the themes I'm seeing.
So once you have registered in the API system, and you've got to upload, that's where you have to upload your transcript and get some other things in place, but you can start getting letters of application, I mean letter writers to write their letters. They can sit in there for a month, and no one's going to do it that far in advance, but you have that capability to, because an email will go out to the person once you've designated them as a reference, and then they can upload it whenever, and then you decide when you're ready to actually, because you're registered in the API system, but then you have to actually submit individual applications to each of the sites you want to apply to, and that's when you designate which letter is and which essays are going to go with which application. So you can really start that, you know, particularly in terms of having conversations with people right away in terms of figuring that out.
Okay. All right.
I just want to say also one last thing in terms of the letter of recommendations as it relates to if you've got a place that does, where assessment is a bigger thing, you've got to have someone who can speak to your ability to do reports, and that one should definitely be a psychologist.
Okay. All right, so let's turn to the final topic. We have just a few minutes here, and that is unique concerns for counseling psychology students. And Brittan, I didn't know if in this last year you experienced some concerns or anything that popped up as you were going through this process?
I would say that the only concern for me that a lot of students are struggling with now are finances, and that this is a very expensive process. So try your best to budget beforehand. But like I said at the very beginning when I was talking about fit, something that was very important to me was social justice. And it was very important to me that the site not only say that in their materials, but also demonstrate that by allowing or mandating that nobody has on-site interviews, or that all the interviews will either be through Skype or phone, or really specify that those that do interview in person won't be given preference over others. So those were things that were very important to me, just because I knew that my finances would not allow me to interview at various places. So that was a struggle that I had. I don't know if other programs get more funding, or if this is just a programmatic issue, or if it's a personal issue, but that was one struggle that I definitely had. But fortunately, because of really being committed to social justice, it allowed me to interview and apply to sites that really felt like a good fit. So I didn't feel like I missed out on anything either.
Okay. And then just any of the other training directors, any kind of things that you think of in terms of unique concerns?
Well, you mentioned, go ahead, Mike.
I'll say that the stereotype of a counseling psych student is that you've got a lot of therapy hours and not a lot of assessment with real clients. And that was true when I was in grad school, and it's still true today. I think programs are doing better at that. But any chance you you can get to pick up some assessment and some work with outside of a counseling center where you're doing other things is going to make you stand out at a site like ours.
Okay, thank you.
I just want
following up on that particular point, if people have met the minimal requirements for assessment, but they're just minimal, I think it's helpful if we can see that they have a little bit of assessment planned for the rest of their time before internship.
Okay, and Eve?
Well, I just want to follow up with Brittan's comment about the cost, and I think that's part of why ACTA, which is the organization of the counseling centers, made a commitment to having it be all phone or Skype interviews, so that people weren't incurring such a big cost. So I think when you're going to counseling centers, that's kind of the natural fit, and it's the sites outside that where it becomes more of an issue. Like, for instance, the master's hours, I think it's much more common within counseling psych that there are master's hours separate from the doctoral program. Okay. Clinical psych, it's less likely to be the case, and that's why when you're applying to clinical programs that have a higher percentage of clinical folks on staff and faculty, and whose applications are coming from clinical psych programs, that's why I think it's worth emailing the training director and just confirming, are you considering the master's hours in this, because you don't want to apply someplace where you're not going to be considered right from the start because certain hours aren't being counted. So that to me is one that I think most places do count those in its combined master's and doctoral hours, but it doesn't hurt to ask if it's not absolutely clear about that on the and when you go to the web page of that site.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to figure out a politically correct way to bring up a concern that I've had with multiple, I think, trainees as of late, with the incredible tension of racial situations and religious freedom. And of course, I'm in College Station, Texas, where we've had multiple situations of high-profile racism that have occurred on campus, and interns have expressed that they are social justice, that's what they, and then seeing when an actual event like this occurs, how the university has to handle it, how you have to legally handle it, how the counseling center has to handle it, has been a real growing experience, I think, for the reality of what you can and can't do in your role. And I'm not sure how, right now, the Tennessee with the religious freedom, that if you're aware of that you can refer clients if you don't, support people who are LGBT. So, that I was talking to somebody in Massachusetts, and I said, we don't have microaggressions. We have aggressions where they hit you over the head. Like, you don't have to look for a subtlety. And I say that with some humor, but also it's become a real training issue. We have to address it right away in orientation, because the idea that I'm social justice oriented maybe is sometimes, I think, setting interns up to fail, and that's my I don't know how else to put that. And I don't mean fail but it's very disheartening for them, I think, sometimes to realize the limitations of what they can do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and to also see it within an institutional context.
Right.
And in that sense, it's not such a failure, but really, because you, as a student, you have the ideals, you have the dreams, you have the wish of what you want to do. And actually, a lot of students are dealing with this already in their academic programs.
Mm-hmm.
And then, because I'm thinking about our colleagues in Missouri, and
That's
then
right.
as they move on to internship. So there is a very harsh reality. It's always been there, but, it's just that much more overt now rather than covert. I mean, we're back in many ways to the old-fashioned racism and having to negotiate that. So it's a huge learning experience for students and faculty and staff, actually, on how to deal with direct, overt expressions of hatred and violence. And it's a reality of our society. It always has been, but it just seems to be ever present in this decade. Okay. Erica, we're at 10 o'clock. I didn't know if there was a burning question or two. Otherwise,
well, we have had, I think, like 4 requests for a couples match quick discussion.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so if you'd like to touch on real quick.
Anybody would like to address that?
I said I think it's used pretty rarely, and I know we lost someone that we ranked really highly that we wanted because they couples matched somewhere else. But other than that, we just haven't had that many people apply with the couples match. I don't think that many people use it.
Okay.
We haven't had anybody in years.
So use it, not use it, or is there a risk even in using that, of not matching? Is that maybe the tenor of the question, Erica?
That's a good question. I think that's a good question for APIC, because they're supposed to set things up, and kind of let you know how it affects, like the match is a wonderful thing. I did internship pre-match, and you kind of had to first choice people, and there is all this craziness, and I would hope that they've set it up in a way where you can, if you're not going to match as a couple, there's backup you can match as an individual, but I just don't know that much about how it works.
If you go to the APIC website, there is some data from previous matches that would maybe let you see how well people matched who did use that process. That might be a helpful place to look for statistics about it.
All right, well, we're at our past 10 o'clock time, so I just want to thank everybody who's been a fantastic member of this panel: Ann Covey, Brittan Davis, Chris Sheldon, Eve Adams, Mike Martin, off camera, Erica, Wiley Whiteman, and Debbie Nolan. So thank you all so much for your help, your assistance, and we sincerely wish the very best to every single student who's patiently listened to us, and wish you the best on this next phase of your training. Good luck, everyone. And this will be available online on the Division 17 website, both webinars on internship. So take care, everyone.
Fabulous.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.